The clock struck midnight on January 1, 1946, and across the world people celebrated. In Times Square, nearly 2 million gathered despite the bitter cold, their breath-forming clouds in the winter air as they shouted and embraced. In London, crowds filled Trafalgar Square, their faces illuminated by spotlights that had been darkened for 6 years of war. In Paris, the Champs-Élysées echoed with singing for the first time since liberation. In Melbourne, Sydney, and Wellington, the celebrations had begun hours earlier, marking not just a new year but the first peacetime new year since 1938. The war was over, Hitler was dead, Mussolini had been executed, Tojo and his generals awaited trial. The swastika no longer flew over Europe and the rising sun had been lowered over Tokyo. After 6 years of the most destructive conflict in human history, the guns had finally fallen silent. More than 60 million people had died, but the killing had stopped. That alone seemed like reason enough to celebrate. Soldiers were coming home. In the United States, troopships arrived daily at New York, San Francisco, and Seattle, carrying men who had fought across North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. They kissed wives they hadn't seen in years, held children who had been born while they were overseas, and tried to remember what normal life felt like. In Britain, demobilization proceeded methodically, releasing men by age and length of service. In Australia and Canada, in South Africa and India, the same scenes repeated. Men returning, families reuniting, communities attempting to piece themselves back together. The newspapers called it victory. The newsreels showed jubilation. Political leaders spoke of a new era of peace, cooperation, and reconstruction. The United Nations had been founded in October 1945, its charter signed by 50 nations committed to preventing another global catastrophe. The trials at Nuremberg had begun in November, establishing a legal framework for holding war criminals accountable. The world, it seemed, was turning a page. But something fundamental had changed in the final days of the war, something most people didn't yet understand. In the celebrations, in the relief, in the exhausted joy of survival, the full implications remained hidden. The strategic bombing campaigns that had destroyed Dresden and Hamburg, Tokyo and Manila had culminated in something different. The firebombing of Japanese cities throughout early 1945 had killed hundreds of thousands. But these attacks required hundreds of aircraft, thousands of bombs, and elaborate planning. What happened in August 1945 was different. 2 cities, 2 aircraft, 2 bombs, nearly 250,000 dead. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the first week of August had ended the war in the Pacific, but they had also severed human history into 2 distinct eras, the world before and the world after. In the world before, warfare had limits imposed by physics and logistics. Total destruction required total effort. In the world after, a single weapon could obliterate a city in seconds. As the world celebrated that New Year's Eve, most people understood the war had ended. They did not yet understand that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The atomic age had begun, and with it came a permanent shadow that would follow human civilization forward into every year that followed. They entered a new year. They did not yet realize they had entered a new world. This documentary series examines the transition into the atomic age through primary sources, archival materials, and documented historical evidence. Each episode draws on declassified documents, official records, and first-hand accounts from military personnel, scientists, political leaders, and civilians who witnessed these events. Our goal is historical accuracy and preservation of this critical period in human history. If you value careful historical documentation, please subscribe and share this work with others interested in understanding how we arrived at the world we inhabit today. The Second World War officially ended on September 2, 1945, when Japanese officials signed the Instrument of Surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed for Japan. Representatives from the United States, Britain, China, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand witnessed the formal conclusion of 6 years of global conflict. But the war's end did not mean the world had healed. Europe lay in ruins. Berlin, once a city of 4 million, was a landscape of rubble. The Reich Chancellery was a shell. The Reichstag a burned-out hulk. In Warsaw, systematic German demolition had destroyed approximately 85% of the city's buildings. The Polish capital, home to 1.3 million people before the war, had been reduced to perhaps 160,000 survivors living among the wreckage. In the Netherlands, the hunger winter of 1944-45 had killed between 18,000 and 22,000 people by starvation. In the Soviet Union, approximately 1,710 cities and towns had been destroyed, along with 70,000 villages. The human cost defied comprehension. The Soviet Union alone had lost between 26 and 27 million people, roughly 14% of its pre-war population. Poland lost approximately 17% of its population, including nearly all of its 3 million Jews. Yugoslavia lost approximately 1.7 million people. Germany itself had lost between 6.5 and 8.8 million, including both military and civilian deaths. China had lost between 15 and 20 million people, the majority civilians killed during the Japanese occupation. In Japan, the situation was desperate. American strategic bombing had destroyed approximately 40% of the urban area in 66 cities. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9-10, 1945 had killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama all had been systematically burned. The Japanese merchant fleet had been virtually eliminated, cutting the home islands off from food and resources. Malnutrition was widespread. Industrial production had collapsed. Then came August. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m. local time, a single American B-29 bomber dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima. The city, home to approximately 350,000 people, and the headquarters of the 2nd General Army responsible for defending southern Japan, was obliterated. The initial blast and thermal radiation killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly. By the end of 1945, the death toll reached approximately 140,000. 3 days later, on August 9, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The death toll by the end of 1945 reached approximately 70,000. Between the two bombings, on August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, Japan's premier fighting force, was crushed in days. Soviet forces advanced into Korea, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast over radio throughout Japan, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor speak. His announcement, delivered in formal court Japanese that many listeners struggled to understand, informed the nation that Japan would accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration and surrender unconditionally. The war was over, but the destruction remained. And something new had entered the world, something that military strategists, political leaders, and scientists were only beginning to comprehend. The atomic bombs had not simply accelerated Japan's surrender. They had demonstrated that a new form of warfare had become possible, one in which the destruction of an entire city no longer required months of bombing but could be accomplished in seconds. As 1945 drew to a close, the Allied occupation of Japan was underway. MacArthur had established his headquarters in Tokyo. War crimes tribunals were being organized. Europe was being divided into occupation zones. The United Nations was preparing to convene. And beneath all the reconstruction plans and diplomatic maneuvering, a new reality was taking shape. Humanity had developed the means to destroy itself on an unprecedented scale, and there was no returning to the world that had existed before August 1945. The Manhattan Project began not as an American initiative, but as a warning from European refugees fleeing fascism. In August 1939, 3 physicists, Leo Szilard, Eugene Wigner, and Edward Teller, drove to a vacation cottage on Long Island to meet with Albert Einstein. The men were Hungarian Jews who had escaped to America. They came with urgent news. German scientists had achieved nuclear fission, and there was reason to believe Nazi Germany might attempt to develop an atomic weapon. They needed Einstein's help to alert President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Einstein, the most famous scientist in the world, agreed to sign a letter drafted by Szilard. Delivered to Roosevelt in October 1939 by economist Alexander Sachs, the letter warned, "It may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium, by which vast amounts of power and large quantities of new radium-like elements would be generated. This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of a new type may thus be constructed." Roosevelt authorized preliminary research, but progress was slow until December 1941, when the attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States fully into the war. In October 1941, British scientists had concluded that an atomic bomb was feasible and could be ready within 2 years. When this assessment reached American officials, the project accelerated. In September 1942, Brigadier General Leslie Groves was appointed military director of what was now officially called the Manhattan Engineer District. Groves had just overseen construction of the Pentagon. He was organized, demanding, and accustomed to managing massive projects. His first major decision was selecting J. Robert Oppenheimer to lead the scientific work. Oppenheimer was an unlikely choice. He was a theoretical physicist with no Nobel Prize and no experience managing large projects. He had past associations with Communist Party members, including his wife and brother. But Groves saw in Oppenheimer exactly what the project needed: brilliance, breadth of knowledge across multiple fields of physics, and the ability to coordinate and inspire other scientists. In early 1943, Oppenheimer established a laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, on a remote mesa 7,300 feet above sea level. He recruited the best physicists in America and Europe. Enrico Fermi came from Chicago, where he had achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in December 1942. Niels Bohr, who had escaped from Nazi-occupied Denmark, arrived in 1943. Hans Bethe headed the theoretical division. Edward Teller worked on weapon design. Richard Feynman, still in his 20s, contributed to calculations. By 1945, Los Alamos employed approximately 6,000 people. The Manhattan Project operated across the United States. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, massive facilities separated uranium-235 from uranium-238, the far more common isotope. The Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant eventually covered 825 acres. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant was, at the time of its completion, the largest building in the world, covering 44 acres under a single roof. At Hanford, Washington, reactors produced plutonium-239. The scale of construction was staggering. Oak Ridge alone required 55,000 workers at peak construction. Security was absolute. Workers were compartmentalized, knowing only their specific tasks. Entire cities were built in secrecy. Oak Ridge's population reached 75,000, but it appeared on no maps. Mail was censored, travel was restricted. Scientists could not discuss their work with colleagues in other divisions. When Niels Bohr visited Los Alamos, he used the name Nicholas Baker. The project cost approximately $2 billion, equivalent to roughly $30 billion in 2024 dollars. Only a handful of people understood the full scope: Roosevelt, later Truman, select members of Congress, military leaders, and the scientists at Los Alamos. The Manhattan Project employed approximately 130,000 people across multiple sites, yet most had no idea what they were building. By mid-1945, two bomb designs had emerged. Little Boy, the uranium bomb, used a gun-type design. One piece of uranium-235 would be fired into another, creating a critical mass and initiating a chain reaction. The design was so straightforward that scientists were confident it would work without testing. Fat Man, the plutonium bomb, used an implosion design. Conventional explosives would compress a plutonium core, increasing its density until it reached critical mass. This design was complex enough that testing was essential. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 a.m., the first atomic bomb was detonated at the Trinity test site in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico. The blast yield was approximately 22 kilotons, equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT. The flash was visible 180 miles away. The mushroom cloud rose 7.5 miles into the atmosphere. Windows shattered 120 miles distant. Oppenheimer later recalled that a line from the Bhagavad Gita came to mind: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Brigadier General Thomas Farrell, who witnessed the test with Groves, wrote in his report, "The whole country was lighted by a searing light with the intensity many times that of the midday sun." 30 seconds after the explosion came first, the air blast pressing hard against the people and things, to be followed almost immediately by the strong, sustained, awesome roar which warned of doomsday and made us feel that we puny things were blasphemous to dare tamper with the forces heretofore reserved to the Almighty. The weapon worked, and within 3 weeks it would be used not in a desert but against a city. The B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay, after pilot Colonel Paul Tibbetts' mother, lifted off from Northfield on Tinian Island at 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945. Tibbetts commanded a crew of 12. The bomb bay carried Little Boy, a uranium gun-type atomic bomb weighing approximately 9,700 pounds. 2 other B-29s accompanied the Enola Gay. The Great Artiste, piloted by Captain Frederick Bach, carried instrumentation to measure the blast. Necessary Evil, piloted by Captain George Marquardt, carried photography equipment. 3 weather reconnaissance aircraft had departed earlier to assess conditions over the potential targets. Hiroshima, Kokura, and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was the primary target. The city lay on the Oda River Delta on Japan's inland sea, home to approximately 350,000 people. It had been deliberately spared from conventional bombing to allow accurate assessment of the atomic bomb's effects. The city housed the headquarters of the Second General Army, commanded by Field Marshal Shunro Kuhata, responsible for defending southern Japan against the anticipated Allied invasion. Approximately 40,000 military personnel were stationed in and around the city. At 7:09 a.m. Hiroshima time, the air raid alert sounded. A single B-29 weather reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted. The all-clear sounded at 7:31 a.m. People emerged from shelters and resumed their morning routines. Many were outside. At 8:17 a.m., Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee released Little Boy over the AA Bridge near the center of Hiroshima. The bomb fell for 43 seconds before detonating at approximately 1,900 feet above ground. The explosion yielded approximately 15 kilotons. The fireball reached temperatures exceeding 1 million degrees Celsius. Thermal radiation ignited flammable materials within a radius of 1.2 miles. People within half a mile of the hypocenter were vaporized, leaving only shadows burned into stone where their bodies had blocked the thermal radiation. The blast wave traveled outward at supersonic speed, destroying virtually everything within a mile. Wooden buildings were obliterated. Concrete structures crumbled. The characteristic mushroom cloud rose to 40,000 feet. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of the Hiroshima Communications Hospital located approximately 1 mile from the hypocenter, survived and kept a diary. His entry from August 6, "The hour was early, the morning still warm and beautiful. Shimmering leaves reflecting sunlight from a cloudless sky made a pleasant contrast with shadows in my garden. Then a tremendous flash of light cut across the sky. Both of us, he and his wife, were terrified to the point of paralysis. Suddenly, a roar like a freight train passed over our house and a great wind. All around me, the hospital walls had collapsed. Where was my wife? No answer. Where were the patients? Nothing." Of the approximately 76,000 buildings in Hiroshima, approximately 70,000 were damaged or destroyed. The blast destroyed 69% of the city's buildings and damaged another 6 to 7%. Fires spread throughout the city, fueled by broken gas lines and the thermal radiation's ignition of combustible materials. A firestorm developed, creating winds that pulled more oxygen into the inferno. The estimated death toll by the end of 1945 reached approximately 140,000. Approximately 70,000 to 80,000 died instantly or within hours. Tens of thousands more died in the following weeks and months from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. Many who appeared to survive relatively unscathed developed symptoms days later: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, hemorrhaging, hair loss, infections. Doctors had no framework for understanding radiation sickness. Hiroshima's medical infrastructure was devastated. Of approximately 200 doctors in the city, over 90% were casualties. Of approximately 1,780 nurses, over 90% were casualties. Most of Hiroshima's hospitals were destroyed or severely damaged. Dr. Hachiya's hospital remained standing but was barely functional. Medical personnel who survived worked without adequate supplies, without understanding what they were treating, and while suffering from radiation exposure themselves. The Enola Gay landed back at Tinian at 2:58 p.m. Tibbets was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The crew was debriefed. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman was returning from the Potsdam Conference aboard the USS Augusta when news of the bombing reached him. He released a prepared statement. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. In Hiroshima, survivors wandered through ruins, searching for family members, seeking medical help, trying to comprehend what had happened. Many did not yet know what an atomic bomb was. They knew only that their city had been destroyed by a single flash of light and that the dead and dying lay everywhere. The war continued, and 3 days later another city would burn. The second atomic mission launched on August 9, 1945, under more difficult circumstances than the first. Major Charles Sweeney commanded the B-29 Boxcar, named for its usual pilot Frederick Bach, who flew the instrumentation plane this time. The bomb was Fat Man, the plutonium implosion weapon, weighing approximately 10,300 pounds with a yield of approximately 21 kilotons, more powerful than Little Boy. The primary target was Kokura, an important industrial city on northern Kyushu with a major arsenal. Nagasaki was the secondary target. Boxcar departed Tinian at 3:47 a.m. with 2 escort aircraft. Problems began immediately. A fuel pump malfunction meant 640 gallons of fuel in the reserve tank could not be accessed. The plan called for a rendezvous with the instrumentation and photography planes over Yakushima Island. The photography plane never appeared at the designated altitude. Sweeney circled for 40 minutes burning precious fuel. Over Kokura, Bombardier Captain Kermit Behan found the target obscured by smoke and clouds. The mission orders required visual identification of the target. Sweeney made 3 passes over Kokura. Japanese anti-aircraft fire intensified. Fighter aircraft were scrambled. After nearly an hour over Kokura, with fuel running critically low, Sweeney turned toward Nagasaki. Nagasaki was also clouded over. Sweeney faced an impossible choice: return to Tinian with the bomb, attempt a ditching at sea, or bomb by radar despite orders requiring visual targeting. He chose to make one bomb run. At the last moment at 11:01 a.m. local time, Bombardier Behan spotted a break in the clouds. He released Fat Man. The bomb detonated at approximately 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley, about 1.5 miles northwest of the planned aiming point. Nagasaki's hilly terrain channeled and deflected the blast, limiting destruction compared to Hiroshima's flat geography. Nevertheless, the explosion devastated the Urakami Valley, home to approximately 240,000 people. The industrial zones north of the city center bore the brunt of the blast. The Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works was obliterated. The Mitsubishi Urakami Ordnance Works was destroyed. Approximately 19,000 of Nagasaki's approximately 52,000 residential buildings were destroyed, with another 14,000 damaged. The death toll by the end of 1945 reached approximately 70,000. Perhaps 40,000 died instantly or within hours. The lower death toll compared to Hiroshima reflected both the terrain's protective effect and the bomb's detonation away from the city center. But the destruction was absolute in the areas directly exposed. Dr. Tatsuhiro Ikazuki worked at the St. Francis Hospital in the Urakami Valley, approximately 1.4 miles from the hypocenter. He survived and later wrote, "The sky turned pink and purple and the temperature suddenly increased. A second later came the explosion, accompanied by a deafening roar. The roof fell in, the building collapsed, and I found myself trapped underneath. When I managed to scramble out, what met my eyes was complete devastation and destruction." The Urakami district had completely vanished. The Urakami Cathedral, the largest Catholic cathedral in East Asia, was destroyed. Of approximately 12,000 Catholics in Nagasaki, approximately 8,500 died. The hypocenter was approximately 500 meters from the cathedral. Boxcar, critically low on fuel, could not return to Tinian. Sweeney diverted to Okinawa, landing with almost no fuel remaining. One engine had failed on approach. The aircraft touched down with just enough fuel for a single pass. News of the second atomic bombing reached Japan's leadership while they were still processing the first attack and the Soviet declaration of war. On the evening of August 9, the Supreme War Council met in Emperor Hirohito's bomb shelter. The group was deadlocked. 3 members, Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yanai, favored acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. 3. Army Minister Korchika Anami, Army Chief of Staff Yashijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Somu Toyoda insisted on conditions including preservation of the imperial system, Japanese handling of war crimes trials, no Allied occupation, and Japanese disarmament of their own forces. Shortly before midnight, Suzuki asked Emperor Hirohito to break the deadlock. Hirohito spoke, "I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation and prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. The time has come when we must bear the unbearable." Japan would surrender, but the formal announcement would take 6 more days. In Nagasaki, survivors faced the same horrors that had struck Hiroshima: fires, radiation sickness, inadequate medical care, and overwhelming casualties. The second atomic bombing demonstrated what the first might have left unclear. This was not an isolated weapon. The United States possessed multiple atomic bombs and was willing to use them. Between August 9 and August 15, 1945, Japan's government wrestled with the decision that would end the war. The debate took place against the backdrop of 3 simultaneous catastrophes: the atomic bombings, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, and the ongoing conventional bombing of Japanese cities. On August 9, the same day Nagasaki was destroyed. Approximately 1.5 million Soviet troops launched Operation August Storm, invading Japanese-occupied Manchuria, Korea, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's premier fighting force, had been stripped of its best units to reinforce defenses of the home islands. The remaining forces, approximately 700,000 troops, many poorly trained and equipped, faced overwhelming Soviet superiority in numbers, armor, and air power. The Soviet offensive was devastating. Advancing up to 60 miles per day, Soviet mechanized forces encircled Japanese positions. In 1 week, the Kwantung Army effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. By August 15, Soviet forces had captured Mukden, Port Arthur, and Dalian. They continued operations into September, occupying all Japanese territories on the Asian mainland, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. Emperor Hirohito's August 9 decision to accept surrender did not immediately end the debate. Hardline military officers, particularly in the army, advocated continued resistance. They argued that Japan could inflict such heavy casualties during an Allied invasion that the Allies would agree to negotiated terms rather than unconditional surrender. They pointed to the fanatical resistance on Iwo Jima and Okinawa as evidence of what the Allies would face invading the home islands. The military had prepared Operation Ketsugo, the defense of Japan. Approximately 2.3 million regular troops, 4 million Army and Navy employees, and 28 million civilian combatants were to resist the invasion. Every harbor and beach was fortified. Suicide attacks would be launched by approximately 10,000 aircraft, 1,300 suicide submarines, and hundreds of small boats packed with explosives. The plan called for total sacrifice. No surrender, fight to the death, inflict maximum casualties. Foreign Minister Togo and the peace faction countered that continuation was suicide. The atomic bombs demonstrated that the United States could destroy Japanese cities without invasion. The Soviet entry meant Japan now faced the world's two strongest military powers. The naval blockade had severed Japan from food and resources. Starvation was spreading. Industrial production had collapsed. On August 12, the United States replied to Japan's conditional acceptance, clarifying that the emperor's authority would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. This created another crisis. Had the Allies agreed to preserve the imperial system or not? The debate continued. On August 14, Emperor Hirohito convened a second imperial conference. Again, the Supreme War Council was deadlocked. Again, Hirohito intervened decisively. I have surveyed the conditions prevailing in Japan and in the world and have concluded that to continue the war would only result in the annihilation of the Japanese people and a prolongation of the suffering of all humanity. I cannot bear to see my innocent people continue to suffer, nor can I stand by and see world civilization destroyed. I have decided to accept the joint declaration, and I hope all my subjects will abide by this decision. The announcement was recorded for broadcast. On the evening of August 14, a group of army officers attempted a coup, occupying the Imperial Palace grounds and searching for the recording to prevent its broadcast. The coup failed. Major Kenji Hatanaka and other leaders committed suicide. At noon on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast throughout Japan. Speaking in formal court Japanese, he announced, "We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable." Most Japanese hearing the broadcast did not immediately understand that their country had surrendered. The language was too formal, too indirect. But the meaning became clear. Japan would lay down arms. The question of what ultimately caused Japan's surrender remains debated. The atomic bombs inflicted unprecedented damage with unprecedented efficiency. The Soviet invasion destroyed Japan's last hope for a negotiated peace through Soviet mediation and raised the specter of communist occupation. Conventional bombing and blockade had already brought Japan to the brink of collapse. What is certain is that Japan surrendered in August 1945, facing circumstances no nation had faced before. The demonstrated ability of an enemy to destroy entire cities with single weapons, the entry of a powerful new enemy, the complete loss of maritime and air control, and the imminent collapse of all food and resource supplies. The combination proved insurmountable. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed for Japan, General MacArthur signed for the Allied powers. Representatives of 9 Allied nations witnessed. The Second World War was officially over. But the world that emerged from that surrender was fundamentally different from the world that had entered the war in 1939. A new age had begun, and as 1945 gave way to 1946, humanity was only beginning to understand what that meant. The celebrations on New Year's Eve 1945 were unlike any in living memory. For the first time since 1938, the world was not at war. The relief was overwhelming, the joy genuine, the hope for peace almost universal. In New York City, Times Square filled with nearly 2 million people despite temperatures barely above freezing. The lighted ball dropped at midnight, a tradition suspended during the war years for security reasons, and the crowd erupted. Confetti rained from office windows, strangers embraced. The war was over, and this was the first peacetime New Year's Eve most young Americans could remember. In London, crowds gathered despite continued rationing and austerity. Britain had won the war but faced economic devastation. The government was nearly bankrupt. Food remained strictly rationed. Housing shortages were acute. Approximately 4 million homes had been damaged or destroyed. But on New Year's Eve, Londoners filled Trafalgar Square and sang Auld Lang Syne with the fervor of people who had survived 6 years of bombardment and emerged victorious. In Paris, the Champs-Élysées echoed with celebration. France was still recovering from 4 years of occupation and the trauma of collaboration and resistance. The Vichy regime had fallen, Marshal Pétain had been convicted of treason, and General Charles de Gaulle led the provisional government. Rebuilding would take decades, but France was free, and that was reason enough to celebrate. In Moscow, Red Square filled with revelers bundled against the bitter cold. The Soviet Union had paid the war's highest price, over 26 million dead, but had emerged as a superpower. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe and Manchuria. Stalin's propaganda machine proclaimed the victory of Soviet arms and communist ideology. The celebration was genuine, but so was the government's determination to control the narrative of who had won the war and at what cost. In Melbourne, Sydney, Wellington, and across the Southern Hemisphere, the celebrations had begun hours before midnight in New York. Australians and New Zealanders had fought across the Pacific and in North Africa. Their casualties were proportionally high. They had lived under the genuine threat of Japanese invasion. The relief at war's end was profound. In Tokyo, there was no celebration. Japan was occupied, defeated, its cities destroyed, its people hungry. Emperor Hirohito had broadcast to the nation on January 1, 1946, but not in celebration. His New Year's message, the first he had ever delivered informally rather than through official imperial proclamations, included the Declaration of Humanity, repudiating the wartime propaganda that had portrayed him as divine. The message signaled the profound changes occupation would bring. The troops were coming home. In the United States, the Navy demobilized rapidly, releasing men by a point system based on length and type of service. By early 1946, the military was releasing approximately 15,000 servicemen per day. The process created enormous logistical challenges. Troopships sailed constantly. Processing centers operated around the clock. Men who had fought from Normandy to Berlin, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, returned to find a country that was already moving on from the war. The transition was not easy. Many veterans struggled with what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. The term didn't exist in 1946. Combat exhaustion, battle fatigue, and shell shock were the closest approximations. Jobs weren't always available. The economy was transitioning from wartime production to peacetime consumption. Strikes and labor unrest were widespread. But the overwhelming mood was optimism. The war was over, the Axis had been defeated, democracy had survived. The United Nations offered hope for preventing future global conflicts. Science and technology developed during the war promised peacetime benefits. Medicine had advanced dramatically. Penicillin was now available. Radar and jet engines promised revolutionary changes in aviation. Nuclear energy, controlled and peaceful, might provide unlimited power. Beneath the optimism, however, some leaders understood that the world had fundamentally changed. The atomic bombings had demonstrated destructive power that transcended previous limits of warfare. President Truman, who had authorized the bombings, understood what the weapons meant. Prime Minister Clement Attlee in Britain, Premier Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, the scientists who had built the bombs, all understood that warfare had entered a new era. But most people celebrating that New Year's Eve did not yet understand. They knew the war had ended with atomic bombs. They had seen the photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had read the newspaper accounts. But the full implications, that humanity now possessed the means to destroy civilization itself, that the weapons would proliferate, that international relations would be forever shaped by the threat of nuclear annihilation, these realities had not yet sunk in. As the clock struck midnight and 1946 began, humanity entered not just a new year but a new historical epoch. The atomic age had begun. The Cold War, though not yet named, was taking shape. The nuclear arms race, though in its infancy, would soon accelerate. The world was celebrating peace, but the peace would be kept for the next 4 decades and beyond by the threat of mutual destruction on a scale never before possible. They entered a new year. They did not yet realize they could never go back. J. Robert Oppenheimer stood before the assembled personnel of Los Alamos on October 16, 1945, to receive the Army-Navy E Award for Excellence in Production. The war had been over for 6 weeks. The laboratory had successfully developed the weapons that ended it. In his acceptance speech, Oppenheimer said, "If atomic bombs are to be added as new weapons to the arsenals of a warring world, or to the arsenals of nations preparing for war, then the time will come when mankind will curse the names of Los Alamos and Hiroshima." The scientists who built the atomic bomb were not monolithic in their views, but many were profoundly troubled by what they had created. The journey from theoretical physics to practical weaponry had taken less than 3 years. The speed had been necessary. The fear that Nazi Germany might develop atomic weapons first had driven the project. But Germany had surrendered in May 1945 and the bombs were used against Japan in August. The moral calculus had shifted. Leo Szilard, the physicist who had convinced Einstein to write to Roosevelt in 1939, was among the first to advocate against using the bomb on Japanese cities. In July 1945, before the Trinity test, Szilard drafted a petition signed by 70 scientists at the Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory, urging President Truman to demonstrate the bomb to Japan rather than use it without warning on a populated target. The petition never reached Truman. It was stopped by the military chain of command. Szilard would later write, "Suppose Germany had developed 2 bombs before we had any bombs. And suppose Germany had dropped 1 bomb, say, on Rochester and the other on Buffalo, and then having run out of bombs she would have lost the war. Can anyone doubt that we would then have defined the dropping of atomic bombs on cities as a war crime, and that we would have sentenced the Germans who were guilty of this crime to death at Nuremberg and hanged them?" The debate among the scientists began before the bombings and intensified afterward. James Franck, who led a committee studying the social and political implications of atomic weapons, issued a report in June 1945 warning that using the bomb would start an arms race and make international control of nuclear weapons nearly impossible. The Franck report recommended a demonstration on an uninhabited area to show the bomb's power without killing civilians. The recommendations were overruled. A target committee, including scientists and military officers, selected Japanese cities. The criteria were clear: military significance, large urban areas, targets that had been spared conventional bombing to allow accurate assessment of the atomic bomb's effects. Hiroshima and Nagasaki met these criteria. After the war, many scientists struggled with what they had done. Oppenheimer, in particular, became a tragic figure. At a meeting with Truman in October 1945, Oppenheimer told the president, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, who bore ultimate responsibility for authorizing the bombings, was reportedly annoyed by Oppenheimer's hand-wringing. He later told an aide, "I told him the blood was on my hands to let me worry about that." Oppenheimer's crisis of conscience deepened over time. He became an advocate for international control of atomic energy and opposed development of the hydrogen bomb in 1949. In a 1947 speech, he said, "In some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose." Enrico Fermi, who had achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in December 1942, had fewer public qualms, but privately he expressed concerns about the implications of nuclear weapons. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist who had contributed to the Manhattan Project, spent years after the war advocating for international cooperation and transparency in atomic research as the only way to prevent catastrophe. Not all scientists regretted their work. Edward Teller, who would later become known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, believed the atomic bomb had saved lives by ending the war quickly. He argued that failing to develop the bomb would have been morally worse if it allowed Nazi Germany to develop it first. Many scientists shared this view. The bomb was necessary, its use justified, or at least understandable given the circumstances. But even those who defended the decision recognized that something fundamental had changed. The physicist II Rabbi later reflected, "I think to a certain extent the scientists of Los Alamos were interested in this thing as a great technical problem and also as a great counter to the threat that such a weapon would be in the hands of Hitler. The actual use of it, I think in some respects, was a maturing of the scientists, of the technological people, you might say, who saw this as a cute problem and a great success if it could be done." By early 1946, the scientists were scattering. Los Alamos remained open as a research facility, but most of the wartime staff departed. Some returned to universities. Others joined newly formed research laboratories. Oppenheimer became director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Many scientists became advocates for arms control, international cooperation, and limitations on nuclear weapons development. The question of responsibility would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had developed weapons of unprecedented destructive power. Those weapons had been used to kill approximately 200,000 people, most of them civilians. The weapons had also ended the most destructive war in human history and possibly prevented an invasion of Japan that would have killed millions more. The moral complexity was irreducible. As 1946 began, the men who had unlocked the atom understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the world, what they had unleashed. They had wanted to defeat fascism. They had succeeded. But they had also given humanity the means to destroy itself, and that knowledge would follow them and the world into every year that followed. The American monopoly on atomic weapons lasted exactly 4 years, though very few people understood at the time how short-lived that monopoly would be. On August 7, 1945, the day after Hiroshima, American newspapers published President Truman's statement revealing the existence of atomic weapons. The announcement shocked the public and leaders worldwide. The secret had been kept so completely that even Vice President Truman had not been informed of the Manhattan Project until after Roosevelt's death in April 1945. The initial global reaction was confusion mixed with awe. Few people understood what an atomic bomb actually was. The photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed total devastation, but strategic bombing had already destroyed dozens of Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo in March had killed more people than the Hiroshima bomb. What made atomic weapons different was not immediately obvious to the general public. Military and political leaders, however, understood immediately. A single aircraft with a single weapon had destroyed an entire city. The implications for warfare were revolutionary. Bernard Brodie, a military strategist who would become one of the founders of nuclear strategy, wrote in 1946, "Thus far the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on its chief purpose must be to avert them. It can have almost no other useful purpose." In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin received news of the Hiroshima bombing while at the Potsdam Conference. He outwardly showed little reaction, but privately he understood that the balance of power had shifted dramatically. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war as the dominant military power in Europe, with the largest army in the world. But that conventional superiority suddenly seemed less important. Stalin immediately accelerated Soviet efforts to develop atomic weapons. The Soviet atomic program had begun earlier than most Americans realized. Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project through multiple sources. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who had worked at Los Alamos, passed detailed information about bomb design to Soviet handlers. Other spies, including David Greenglass and Theodore Hall, also provided information. By August 1945, the Soviets had substantial intelligence about American bomb designs. Stalin appointed Lavrentiy Beria, head of the NKVD secret police, to oversee the Soviet atomic program. Igor Kurchatov led the scientific work. The program proceeded with ruthless efficiency. Resources were unlimited. Scientists and engineers worked under constant pressure and surveillance. Gulag labor built the facilities. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, RDS-1, on August 29, 1949, shocking American intelligence analysts who had predicted the Soviets would not have a bomb until the mid-1950s. Great Britain, which had contributed significantly to the Manhattan Project, expected to maintain its partnership with the United States in atomic research after the war. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946, however, prohibited sharing atomic information with foreign nations, including Britain. Britain responded by developing its own independent nuclear capability, testing its first atomic bomb in October 1952. France, despite its exclusion from the wartime atomic program, began its own nuclear research after the war. Charles de Gaulle was determined that France would not become a second-rate power dependent on American or British nuclear protection. France tested its first atomic bomb in February 1960. China, after the communist victory in 1949, developed nuclear weapons with initial Soviet assistance, testing its first bomb in October 1964. The proliferation that Szilard, Frank, and other Manhattan Project scientists had warned about became reality. Their warnings in 1945 about the impossibility of maintaining a monopoly proved accurate. By the mid-1960s, 5 nations possessed nuclear weapons. By By 2024, 9 nations would have them. But in early 1946, the American monopoly still held, and American policymakers debated how to manage it. Two broad approaches emerged. One, advocated by Secretary of War Henry Stimson and others, called for sharing atomic knowledge with the Soviet Union under international control in the hope of preventing an arms race. The other, supported by those who distrusted Soviet intentions, advocated maintaining the monopoly as long as possible. In January 1946, the United Nations established the Atomic Energy Commission to address the control and peaceful use of atomic energy. In June 1946, the United States proposed the Baruch Plan, named for Bernard Baruch, who presented it. The plan called for international control of all nuclear facilities with inspections to verify compliance. Once the international system was in place, the United States would destroy its atomic stockpile. The Soviet Union rejected the plan, arguing that the United States should destroy its weapons first, before any international system was established. The Soviets also opposed the inspection provisions as violations of sovereignty. The Baruch Plan died, and with it died the best chance for international control of atomic weapons before an arms race began. As 1946 progressed, the outlines of the Cold War became clearer. Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in March 1946, declaring, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent." The wartime alliance between the United States and Soviet Union fractured over the future of Eastern Europe, Germany, and the global balance of power. Atomic weapons became central to this emerging confrontation. The United States relied on its atomic monopoly to balance Soviet conventional superiority in Europe. The Soviets worked frantically to break that monopoly. The nuclear arms race had begun, and it would define international relations for the next 4.5 decades. By the time the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, the world had changed. The brief moment when only one nation possessed nuclear weapons was over. The era of mutual vulnerability had begun. And the fear that had been manageable when only one nation possessed the bomb became existential when two hostile superpowers could destroy each other and much of the world in a matter of hours. The people celebrating on New Year's Eve 1945 could not have imagined this future. But the leaders and scientists understood. As 1946 began, they knew that the world had entered a permanent state of nuclear danger, and there was no going back. The atomic bomb rendered obsolete nearly every assumption that had governed warfare for centuries. Military planners, strategists, and political leaders in 1946 began the difficult work of thinking through what nuclear weapons meant for the future of conflict. Traditional warfare assumed that defense was possible, that civilians could be protected, that cities could be fortified, that wars could be fought and won through superior strategy, training, logistics, and industrial capacity. Nuclear weapons negated these assumptions. There was no defense against atomic attack. Cities could not be meaningfully protected. Industrial capacity mattered only until war began. After that, the side that struck first might destroy the other's capacity to retaliate. This led to the most disturbing realization of the atomic age. The primary purpose of nuclear weapons was not to be used, but to prevent their use by threatening retaliation. Deterrence, not victory, became the strategic objective. War between nuclear powers became unwinnable because winning in any meaningful sense was impossible. Both sides would be destroyed. Bernard Brodie, working at Yale University's Institute of International Studies, published The Absolute Weapon: Atomic Power and World Order in 1946. Brodie's central insight was that nuclear weapons transformed the purpose of military force. Previously, military establishments existed to win wars. Now their purpose was to prevent wars. Brodie wrote, "Everything about the atomic bomb is overshadowed by the twin facts that it exists, and that its destructive power is fantastically great." Brodie recognized that deterrence required credible retaliatory capability. If one side could destroy the other's ability to retaliate through a first strike, deterrence would fail. This led to the concept of second strike capability. A nation's nuclear forces must be able to survive an enemy first strike and still inflict unacceptable damage in retaliation. This requirement would drive decades of strategic decisions. Hardened missile silos, nuclear-armed submarines, bomber forces on constant alert, early warning systems, and secure command and control. In 1946, however, these concepts were still emerging. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which assessed the effects of strategic bombing in Europe and Japan, provided data on the bomb's effects but struggled to imagine what a future war would look like. American war plans in the immediate post-war years assumed that if war with the Soviet Union came, atomic bombs would be used against Soviet cities. The plans were crude. Drop all available bombs on Soviet urban and industrial centers, hope the destruction would force surrender. The Soviet Union, lacking atomic weapons until 1949, relied on conventional military superiority in Europe. Soviet war plans from the late 1940s called for rapid armored advances across Western Europe, potentially reaching the English Channel before American atomic strikes could be organized. The plans acknowledged that Soviet cities would be destroyed by American bombs, but assumed that Soviet forces would control Europe by the time the atomic campaign concluded. Neither side's plans adequately grappled with the humanitarian catastrophe both scenarios implied. Millions of civilians would die in Soviet cities. Hundreds of thousands of American and Western European soldiers and civilians would die in conventional combat. The level of destruction contemplated made World War II seem almost restrained by comparison. As both sides acquired more nuclear weapons, the United States had approximately 50 bombs by 1948, over 200 by 1950. The destructive potential grew. When the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, American strategic planners had to confront mutual vulnerability. Some advocated for preventive war, attack the Soviet Union before it could build a substantial nuclear arsenal. Others recognized that preventive war was morally indefensible and practically uncertain. The Soviet Union was vast, and the United States couldn't be certain it had destroyed all Soviet nuclear facilities. The development of thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, in the 1950s escalated the danger to a new level. Where atomic bombs were measured in kilotons, thousands of tons of TNT equivalent, hydrogen bombs were measured in megatons, millions of tons. The first American hydrogen bomb test in 1952 yielded 10.4 megatons. The largest ever tested, the Soviet Tsar Bomba in 1961, yielded 50 megatons. A single weapon could destroy an entire metropolitan area. The concept of overkill emerged. Both sides accumulated enough weapons to destroy each other many times over. By the 1960s, the United States and Soviet Union each possessed thousands of nuclear weapons. The destructive capacity exceeded anything strategically necessary. The arsenals existed not because the weapons served military purposes, but because neither side dared allow the other numerical superiority. Civilian casualties ceased to be collateral damage and became the primary objective of nuclear strategy. Cities were targets not for their military value but to hold populations hostage. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, appropriately abbreviated as MAD, emerged in the 1960s. Both sides maintained large nuclear arsenals to ensure that any nuclear attack would result in the attacker's destruction. The strategy relied on the certainty of mutual annihilation to prevent war. The implications were profound. For the first time in history, major powers could not go to war with each other without risking their own destruction. The superpowers fought proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, and dozens of other locations, but they never directly fought each other. The Cold War remained cold because it could not become hot without becoming catastrophic. This situation created what strategists called the nuclear peace, the longest period without war between major powers in modern history. But the peace was maintained by threatening hundreds of millions of civilians with instant annihilation. Every day of the Cold War, thousands of nuclear weapons stood ready to launch within minutes. Command centers operated continuously. Bomber crews sat on alert. Missile submarines patrolled the oceans. The world lived under a permanent threat that had no precedent in human history. As 1946 began, these developments were still years away, but the foundation had been laid. The atomic bomb had fundamentally changed warfare, making it both more destructive and less likely between nuclear-armed powers. The paradox would define the next half-century. The most powerful weapons ever created ensured they would never be used, precisely because their use would be suicidal. By mid-1946, the full scope of the atomic bomb's effects in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was becoming clear. The initial casualties, approximately 140,000 in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki by the end of 1945, were only the beginning. Radiation sickness continued to kill survivors for months and years after the bombings. Dr. Takashi Nagai, a physician and survivor in Nagasaki, documented the progression of radiation illness. Patients who appeared to have survived relatively unscathed developed symptoms weeks after exposure. Severe fatigue, loss of appetite, fever, hemorrhaging under the skin, loss of hair, increased susceptibility to infection. Without understanding radiation's biological effects, doctors could do little beyond providing supportive care. Many patients died despite appearing to recover initially. The long-term effects took years to document. Increased rates of leukemia appeared within a few years. Solid cancers, breast, lung, thyroid showed increased incidence after longer latency periods. Genetic effects in children of survivors were studied for decades. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established by the United States in 1946, tracked survivors throughout their lives, collecting data that formed the basis for understanding radiation's effects on human health. Approximately 360,000 people were recognized as hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors in Japan. Many faced discrimination. Some employers refused to hire them, fearing they carried disease. Marriage prospects were damaged by concerns about genetic damage. The psychological trauma of surviving while so many died created what survivors called survivor's guilt. Many never spoke about their experiences. The physical reconstruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki proceeded slowly. Both cities were rebuilt, but the decision of what to preserve and what to rebuild sparked debate. The Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, one of the few buildings left standing near the hypocenter, was preserved as the Genbaku Dome Atomic Bomb Dome, a permanent memorial. The Nagasaki hypocenter was marked and memorialized. Both cities became symbols of nuclear devastation, visited by millions seeking to understand what had happened. The United States conducted extensive studies of the bomb's effects, both for scientific understanding and for strategic planning. The Strategic Bombing Survey sent teams to Japan to document the damage. The data informed future bomb designs and strategic targeting. The information was classified. The American public did not learn many details about radiation effects for years. Testing of nuclear weapons continued. The United States conducted Operation Crossroads in July 1946, detonating 2 atomic bombs at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands to study their effects on naval vessels. The tests were widely publicized, filmed, and attended by congressional observers. The images of mushroom clouds over the Pacific Fleet entered popular culture. More tests followed. 23 tests in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958, including the Castle Bravo test in 1954, which yielded 15 megatons, the largest American nuclear test ever conducted. The test contaminated nearby islands and a Japanese fishing vessel, Lucky Dragon 5, whose crew suffered radiation sickness. 1 crew member died. The Soviet Union conducted its testing program at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, beginning in 1949. Over 456 nuclear tests were conducted there between 1949 and 1989. The local population suffered significant health effects from radiation exposure. The environmental contamination persisted for decades. Britain tested weapons in Australia at Maralinga and Emu Field, and later at Malden Island and Christmas Island in the Pacific. France tested weapons in Algeria and later in French Polynesia. China tested weapons at Lop Nor in Xinjiang. Each testing program left environmental damage and affected populations near the test sites. The Nevada test site, established in 1951, conducted 928 announced nuclear tests between 1951 and 1992, 100 of them atmospheric. Residents of downwind communities in Nevada, Utah, and Arizona were exposed to radioactive fallout. Cancer rates in these communities increased significantly. The government initially denied the danger. Acknowledgement and compensation came only decades later. The environmental and human cost of the nuclear age extended far beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Uranium mining exposed workers to radon and created contaminated sites. Nuclear weapons production facilities released radioactive materials into the environment. The Hanford site in Washington, which produced plutonium for Fat Man and subsequent weapons, released radiation into the Columbia River and surrounding areas. The Mayak Production Association in Russia's Chelyabinsk Oblast experienced severe contamination, including the 1957 Kyshtym disaster, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, which was kept secret for decades. By 1946, the nuclear age had created not just weapons, but an entire industrial complex with environmental and health consequences that would persist for generations. The immediate aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was measured in deaths and destruction. The long-term aftermath was measured in radiation exposure, cancer, genetic damage, environmental contamination, and the permanent presence of weapons that could never be uninvented. The world that celebrated New Year's Eve 1945 hoped the war's end meant a return to normalcy. By mid-1946, it was becoming clear that normalcy was impossible. The atomic age meant living with constant awareness of human mortality on a civilizational scale. The weapons existed, more would be built, Their effects would persist for decades, and the knowledge of how to build them could never be erased. January 1, 1946 was the first day of peacetime for most of the world's population since September 1, 1939. For millions, it was the first peaceful new year they could remember as adults. The celebrations were genuine, the relief profound, the hope for a better future sincere. But January 1, 1946 was also the first day of the nuclear age, a permanent condition of human existence, not a temporary crisis that could be resolved and left behind. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 4.5 months earlier had created a new reality that every subsequent generation would inherit. The people celebrating that new year understood the war had ended with atomic weapons. They did not yet understand that the atomic weapons would shape every year that followed. They could not imagine that within 4 years, the Soviet Union would have atomic bombs. They could not foresee that within 15 years, both superpowers would possess hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful. They could not predict that nuclear weapons would number in the tens of thousands, mounted on missiles that could reach any point on Earth within 30 minutes. The leaders and scientists understood better, but even they underestimated the full implications. In 1946, Oppenheimer, Bohr, Szilard, and others advocated for international control of atomic energy, believing that rational people seeing the danger would choose cooperation over competition. They were wrong. The Cold War divided the world into hostile camps. The arms race accelerated rather than slowed. The bomb became plural bombs by the thousands. The survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki understood most clearly. They had experienced what nuclear weapons actually meant, not abstract megatonnage or strategic calculations, but burning flesh, vaporized families, radiation sickness, permanent trauma. They spent their lives warning the world. Many people listened. Most nodded sympathetically and then continued with their lives, the danger too enormous to internalize. By the 1960s, schoolchildren in the United States practiced duck and cover drills, crawling under desks in response to air raid sirens as if desks could protect against nuclear blasts. The drills were absurd, but they reflected a genuine fear. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been. For 13 days, American and Soviet leaders negotiated while their military forces prepared for war. The crisis was resolved, but the danger remained. The Cold War ended in 1991, but the nuclear danger did not. 9 nations now possess nuclear weapons. Several thousand remain on high alert, ready to launch within minutes. Nuclear proliferation continues. Terrorist groups seek nuclear materials. The knowledge of how to build the weapons cannot be erased. Every year, somewhere in the world, someone is working on nuclear weapons technology. The atomic age has now lasted nearly 80 years, longer than most people's lifetimes. Generations have been born and died never knowing a world without nuclear weapons. The danger has become normalized background noise in global politics. Treaties have limited arsenals, established monitoring regimes, and created diplomatic frameworks for managing the danger. But the weapons remain, and they cannot be uninvented. As we look back from 2025 to that New Year's Eve in 1945, the contrast is stark. They celebrated the end of one nightmare without fully realizing they were entering another. They hoped for peace without understanding that the peace would be maintained by threatening mutual annihilation. They wanted to return to normal without grasping that normal no longer existed. The world that emerged from World War II was not the world that entered it. The atomic bomb ensured that humanity would forever live with the knowledge that it possessed the means to destroy itself. That knowledge has shaped every subsequent decade. The Cold War arms race, the doctrine of deterrence, the proxy wars fought because direct conflict was too dangerous, the near misses when the world came close to nuclear war, the treaties and agreements that tried to manage the danger, the protests and peace movements, the nightmares of generations who grew up under the shadow of potential annihilation. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have gradually passed away. The last hibakusha will eventually die, but their testimony remains, recorded in books, interviews, museums, and archives. They warned that nuclear weapons must never be used again. They described what those weapons actually do to human bodies, to cities, to survivors' lives. They hoped the world would listen and abolish these weapons. The world has not abolished them. More than 75 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, approximately 12,500 nuclear weapons exist. The danger has changed form but not disappeared. The Cold War's bipolar confrontation has given way to a multipolar world where more actors possess nuclear capabilities. The risk of accidental war. miscalculation, or deliberate use by smaller nuclear powers or non-state actors may actually be higher now than during the Cold War's rigid standoff. That New Year's Eve 1945, as the clock struck midnight and crowds celebrated in Times Square, Trafalgar Square, the Champs-Élysées, and around the world, humanity stood at a threshold. Behind them was the most destructive war in history. Ahead of them was a future that would be shaped by weapons capable of ending human civilization. They entered a new year full of hope for peace and normalcy. They did not realize they had entered a new era from which there would be no exit. The atomic age had begun, and 80 years later it continues. Every day since August 6, 1945 has been lived under the shadow of nuclear weapons. Humanity changed course that year. We are still following the trajectory that began when two cities burned in August 1945, and the world celebrated peacetime that December while standing on the edge of an abyss it did not yet fully see. The world entered 1946 and unknowingly entered a permanent condition, the knowledge that we can destroy ourselves paired with the hope that we will choose not to. That tension has defined every year since. It defines this year still.